The linen on the sideboard had been laid an hour earlier than the guests expected, and Prudence Ashcombe was smoothing the last crease with the flat of her palm when her stepmother's laugh cracked through the drawing-room doorway like a piece of dropped porcelain. It was the laugh Prudence had learned to identify in the dark of childhood, the pitched, silver laugh her stepmother used only when she was making a joke at someone else's expense and expected the room to be grateful for it. Prudence did not lift her head. She smoothed the next crease. There was a chip in the enamel of the tureen, and she covered it with a sprig of rosemary, the way she had covered it for 2 years, and she wondered, with the small, deadpan corner of her mind that no one had ever seen, whether the tureen and she were kept for the same reason and hidden in the same way. Behind her, in the drawing room, 3 of the county's finer ladies were taking sherry with her stepmother before the dinner, and her stepmother was saying something about the eldest Ashcombe girl, which was Prudence, and about the difficulty of the matter, which was also Prudence, and the ladies were making the small, polite sounds ladies made when they were not sure whether it would be rude to agree out loud. "Oh, we've quite despaired of her, of course," her stepmother was saying, in the tone one used for a spaniel that had grown too fat to catch its own tail. "One does what one can. But no one, my dears, no one would take the fat girl, not with 2 prettier sisters standing behind her. It is only kindness now to stop pretending." The words came through the open door and settled on Prudence's shoulders as clean as snow. She did not flinch. She had trained that out of herself before she was 20. She pressed the rosemary sprig a fraction of an inch to the left because it looked better there, and she picked up the empty tray and turned toward the servants' passage, as though nothing had passed through the air behind her at all. That was the discipline. The discipline was the tureen. The discipline was the rosemary. The discipline was to keep her back straight and her hands full, and her eyes on the next necessary thing, because the moment she stopped being useful, the house would notice that she was also a person, and the house did not like being reminded of that. What she did not know, what she could not have known, standing there in her plain, gray wool with her heavy braid, pinned low against a neck that had never known a jewel, was that a 4th person had come into the drawing room a moment before her stepmother spoke, and that this person had stopped in the doorway rather than announcing himself, and that he had heard the whole of it. He had heard the laugh. He had heard the sentence. He had watched, from that doorway, the young woman at the sideboard receive the words without a flicker, and he had watched her hand move the little sprig of rosemary with the calm of a physician setting a bone. He noticed, as he noticed a great many things others missed, that she did not once glance toward the drawing room, though she must have known perfectly well who was in it. He noticed that her breath did not catch. He noticed that she was, in the ordinary sense of the word, quite beautiful. A broad, steady face lit by candles, the strong line of a jaw held level, a mouth that had not yet decided whether it would allow itself to smile that evening. And then he noticed something else, which was that he had come here on an errand, and that the errand had, in the space of one overheard sentence, changed entirely. His name was Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Harrowmere, and it will be necessary, child, before we go further, to understand what sort of man was standing in that doorway, because he was not, as the room supposed him, merely a great match come to inspect 3 provincial daughters. He was a widower of 39, whose wife had been dead 4 winters, and whose only son had not spoken above a whisper in 18 months. He had come to the Ashcombe house that evening because his solicitor had told him that the eldest Ashcombe girl was reputed to be a woman of sense, and that a man in his particular circumstance, a man with a silent child and a household of servants who had begun to whisper about doctors, might do worse than a woman of sense. He had come, in short, to look at Prudence Ashcombe. He had come to look at her and to decide, and to be gone before the fish course. He had not expected to find her setting her own table. He had certainly not expected to find her stepmother selling the other 2 daughters over her head, in her hearing, with a laugh. The Duke of Harrowmere had built his life on the discipline of not being surprised. He had inherited that discipline from a father who had considered surprise a weakness of the lower orders, and he had polished it in a marriage that had asked him for a great many things, and given him warmth in return only at the end, when there had not been time. He was a man who noticed. He noticed the servant girl's tired hands as she took his coat. He noticed that the wallpaper in the vestibule had been turned to hide a stain. He noticed the pearls on the second daughter and the way they did not quite match. And he noticed the sherry decanter had been refilled with something less costly. And he noticed, above all, the tall, stout young woman in gray who had just walked past him with an empty tray as though he were not there. She had walked past him, Nathaniel Vane, whom the room upstairs was arranging itself to receive as though he were the weather, had been stepped around by a woman in a servant's apron who was not a servant, and she had done it with the small, firm efficiency of someone who had been stepping around obstacles all her life. "Miss Ashcombe," he said. Prudence stopped. She stopped, and she turned, tray still in her hands, and for the first time that evening she looked at the man in her father's hall, and understood, all at once, from the cut of his coat and the quality of his stillness, and the particular deference the doorway itself seemed to give him, exactly who he was. She did not curtsy. She did not have a free hand. She inclined her head instead, the small correct inclination of a woman whose father had once been a scholar, and whose mother had once known how to enter a room. "Your Grace, you are Miss Ashcombe." "I am the eldest, yes." "Then it is you I came to see." Behind her, in the drawing-room, the silver laugh had gone quite silent. Prudence considered him. The tray was heavy. She did not put it down. Some warning older than reason told her that if she put the tray down in front of this man, she would be handing him something, and she was not sure yet what he was offering to take. "Your Grace has come at a poor moment," she said evenly. "My stepmother is in the drawing-room. She will be delighted to receive you." "I do not doubt it," said the Duke. He did not move. She did not move. For one long, unmeasured second, the hall held a silence that was, Prudence would think much later, the first honest silence she had shared with another adult human being since her father had died. And into that silence the Duke of Harrowmere said, in a voice so quiet it did not carry past her, "I was already at the door. Some of what your stepmother said reached me." Prudence's hands did not tighten on the tray. She did not permit it. "My stepmother says a great deal, Your Grace. Not all of it needs to be heard." "No," he said. "Very little of it, I should think." And that, though she could not have named it at the time, was the sentence that began everything. He asked her then, without ceremony and without warmth, whether she would give him a quarter of an hour in her father's study. He said it the way a man says a thing he has already decided. He said, "I have a matter to put to you, and I would prefer to put it to you before your stepmother has arranged herself." He did not smile. There was, Prudence noticed, no charm in him at all, no attempt at any, and it struck her, with the small, dry corner of her mind, that this was the first man in a decade who had spoken to her as though she were the person in the room whose answer mattered. She set the tray down on the sideboard. She said, "A quarter of an hour, Your Grace. My father's study is through here." She led him past the drawing-room door without looking in. She could feel her stepmother rising, could feel the swish of moving silk, could feel the words already forming. But the Duke walked at her shoulder as though he did not see the drawing-room at all, and by the time her stepmother reached the hall, Prudence had closed the study door behind them both. The study smelled of old paper and the ghost of her father's tobacco. She had kept it as he had left it. Her stepmother had tried, twice, to have the books catalogued for sale, and both times Prudence had, without noise or drama, prevented it. It was the only room in the house that was still hers. She lit a second candle from the first, because he was a duke, and the room ought to look at him kindly, and she turned, and she folded her hands, and she waited. He did not sit. He stood at the far side of the desk, and he said without preamble, "I need a wife by the end of next month." Prudence said nothing. "I have a son," said the Duke. "He is 7. He was 5 when his mother died. He has not spoken a full sentence to anyone since her funeral. My household has had 4 governesses in 18 months. My mother-in-law has petitioned the court to remove him to her guardianship on grounds that a motherless boy in a bachelor house is a boy neglected, and the trustees will hear her petition on the 12th of next month. My solicitor advises that a respectable marriage before that date would end the matter." He said all of this the way another man might have named the counties his estates lay in. "I came here," he continued, "because your solicitor, who was, I believe, your father's clerk before he was your solicitor, spoke of you to mine. He said you were a woman of sense, of some education, and of a temper unlikely to be moved by hysterics. He did not mention that your household treats you as an unpaid housekeeper. He also did not mention that you were beautiful, but I would not have expected him to." Prudence's breath caught, very briefly, on the last word. She did not permit it to show. "Your Grace is direct. I have not the time to be otherwise. My son needs a mother. You need, I believe, a house of your own. I am not offering romance. I am offering an arrangement whose terms would be equal on both sides. You would be Duchess of Harrowmere. You would have authority over my nursery, my household, and, within reason, my purse. In return you would be, in law and in public, my wife, and my son would be safe from his grandmother." Prudence let the silence sit for a moment. She had trained herself, over years, not to speak into a silence until she had measured it. "And what," she said at last, "would you require in private, your Grace, that you have not just said out loud?" The Duke did not flinch. "Nothing you do not offer," he said. "I have not that kind of hunger. I had a wife. I loved her. She died. I do not propose to ask a woman I do not know to stand in for her." "That is honest," Prudence said. "It is also the answer of a man who thinks the arrangement will cost him nothing." He looked at her, then properly, the way a man looks at a witness who has just changed her testimony. "I did not say that." "No, your Grace, but you assumed it. You assumed I would say yes because I have no better offer, and my stepmother has just, in your hearing, declared me unmarriageable. You are, in that, no crueler than she is. But I would prefer, before I answer anything, that you tell me the truth, all of it. I do not bargain with half a story." She did not know where the words had come from. She was aware, distantly, that her hands were quite cold, and that her heart was doing something inadvisable inside her ribs, and that she had just spoken to a duke as though he were a farmer disputing the price of hay. It was, she thought, the sort of thing a woman said once in her life, and then paid for. The Duke of Harrowmere looked at her for a long moment. Then he sat down. He sat down in her father's chair, quite as though he had been invited, and he set his hat on the desk beside him, and he said, "Very well, Miss Ashcombe, you shall have the whole of it." And he told her. He told her about a boy who had once been a talkative child, quick to laugh, and who had gone into his mother's sick room the day before she died, singing a hymn she had taught him, a small English hymn about the shepherd and the lamb, and had come out an hour later and had not sung, or spoken above a whisper, since. He told her that the boy's grandmother, a woman of firm views and a great grief of her own, had told the child, in a moment she probably regretted and had never taken back, that his singing had tired his mother into the fever, and that if he had loved her, he would have been quiet. He told her that the boy now believed his voice had killed his mother, that he flinched from music, that he would not open the curtains of the nursery, because his mother had liked the curtains open, and to open them was to remember, that he ate as required, and slept as ordered, and read alone, and that 4 governesses had told the Duke, in tones of increasing self-satisfaction, that the child was simply stubborn. Prudence, listening, had gone very still. "He is not stubborn," she said quietly. "No. He is holding his breath, because he thinks if he lets it out, it will hurt someone." The Duke of Harrowmere looked at her across the desk with an expression she did not, at the time, know how to read. Later, much later, she would understand that it was the expression of a man who had just heard, from the mouth of a stranger, the exact truth about his son that he himself had known and had never been able to say. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I did not come here to be understood." "No, Your Grace, but you are being." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "The trustees meet on the 12th. I would not press you for an answer tonight, but I have not the luxury of a week. Will you give me your answer by Friday?" Prudence thought of the drawing room. She thought of her stepmother's silver laugh. She thought of the tureen with its covered chip, and the sisters with their new pearls, and the 29 years she had spent making herself invisible in a house that had never once made room. She thought of a small boy in a curtained room who believed he had killed his mother with a hymn. She thought, and she was too honest not to admit it, that she was not sure whether she was accepting because of the boy, or because of the house, or because for the first time in her life a man had sat down in her father's chair and asked her to tell him what she saw. "I will give you my answer now, Your Grace," she said, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "I will not enter your house as decoration. I will not be introduced as your hired help in a duchess's title. I will have full and unquestioned authority in your nursery from the first day. Your son's mother is not to be erased. Her portrait stays. Her hymn is not to be forbidden. Her name is to be said in the house as often as the child needs to say it. I will not be asked to replace her. I will not perform any affection I do not feel, and I will not have affection performed at me. And," here her voice steadied on a stone she had not known was in her, "you will not ever use the word that my stepmother used tonight. Not of me, not of any other woman under your roof. Not in jest, not in temper. Not at all." The Duke of Harrowmere listened. He did not interrupt, and when she was finished, he said, without a flicker, "Agreed, on every point. Have you a further condition?" "Only one. If you find, after a season, that the bargain does not answer, you will tell me plainly. You will not let me discover it by inference. I have spent a great many years being tolerated in silence, and I will not do it again." He stood then. He came around the desk. He did not take her hand. He was not a man to reach. But he stood in front of her and he said, "Miss Ashcombe, I will tell you a thing before we go back into that hall. I came here tonight expecting to offer a bargain to a sensible woman. I did not expect to find one who set the terms. I am obliged to you for it." Prudence discovered, to her own surprise, that she had begun to smile. "That is not quite gratitude, Your Grace." "No," he said, "it is not. And here, child, we shall step out of that study for a moment, because it is important that you understand what happened next, and the memory belongs more truly to him than to her." For the Duke of Harrowmere, walking back through that draughty hall with a stout young woman in gray wool at his elbow, felt for the first time in 4 winters something he had thought he had put down for good, which was the sensation of walking beside a person, rather than at the head of a procession. He did not name it to himself. He was not the naming sort. He only noticed, in his ordinary way of noticing, that when she opened the drawing-room door and her stepmother rose with her silver mouth already forming a welcome, Prudence Ashcombe did not step back to allow the Duke to enter first. She walked in, and he walked in with her, at her shoulder, and this small violation of 100 rules of precedence went unremarked by everyone in the room except its 2 authors. The stepmother's name was Millicent Ashcombe, and she was, Prudence would learn from her father's old solicitor within the week, several £1,000s deeper into debt than she had allowed her stepdaughter to know. She rose now in a rustle of taffeta the shade of a bruise, and she said, "Your Grace, we had quite despaired. Prudence, my dear, whatever were you thinking? Keeping his Grace in that dusty little room." "Mrs. Ashcombe," said the Duke, without so much as glancing at Prudence's sisters, who had arranged themselves on a chaise like porcelain figurines in a shop window. "I have come to inform you that Miss Prudence Ashcombe has done me the honor of accepting my hand. The banns will be read this Sunday. The wedding will take place at Harrowmere on the 8th. I shall not be staying to dinner." He said it precisely as he had said everything else, as though he were reading from a page. The drawing room, for the first time in living memory, made no sound at all. Prudence watched her stepmother's face. She watched the several small stages of it, the disbelief, the search for a joke, the search for a mistake, and then the last stage, which was the arithmetic, the moment in which Mrs. Ashcombe realized that the stepdaughter she had just, that very evening, declared unmarriageable in the hearing of 3 witnesses had been chosen in that hall, over the 2 prettier daughters on the chaise, by the wealthiest bachelor in the county. Prudence had never, in 29 years, had the pleasure of watching her stepmother do a sum in public. It was, she thought, with the dry, small corner of her mind, a rather remarkable arithmetic. "But, Your Grace," Millicent said, and could go no further. "Good evening, Mrs. Ashcombe," said the Duke. He did not bow. He turned to Prudence. "I shall send my carriage on Monday. My housekeeper will be at your disposal. Is there anything you wish to bring from this house?" Prudence thought, quite clearly, of her father's books. "Yes, Your Grace. My father's library. Every volume of it." "It will be done." He inclined his head to her, only to her, and he was gone. The door had scarcely closed before Millicent Ashcombe found her voice, and it was not a silver voice any longer. It was thinner, and it was uglier, and it said a great many things Prudence had heard versions of before, all of them designed to persuade her that some mistake had been made, that the Duke could not have meant it, that Prudence was to write at once explaining that she had misunderstood, that she was to think of the family, that it was indecent to be chosen at her age and in her size, and with 2 prettier sisters passed over. Prudence let her stepmother speak. She let her speak, and when the woman had run herself out and stood in the middle of the drawing-room with her hand trembling on the back of a chair, Prudence said only, without heat, "Mrs. Ashcombe, I set his table tonight. I set every table in this house since I was 17. I have never once been thanked. I am to be married on the 8th. I will not write to him. I will not think again of the family. Good night." And she walked past her stepmother, past her sisters, and up the stairs to her own small room. She closed the door. She sat down on the edge of the bed, and she found that she was, to her own great astonishment, not crying, and not laughing, but breathing quite steadily, in a way she had not breathed for a long time, because a man had sat down in her father's chair and asked her what she saw. The house he took her to was called Harrowmere, and it stood on a north-facing rise above a village that had lost half its young men to a bad winter, and it was, when Prudence saw it for the first time from the carriage window on a gray Monday afternoon, the coldest house she had ever seen from the outside. Not in temperature, in light. The windows were shuttered on the upper floor. The great front doors had been recently painted, but the paint was already dulling at the joints, as though the house itself did not believe in the effort. The Duke was not in the courtyard to meet her. His housekeeper was, a small dark woman of perhaps 50, whose apron was very white and whose hands were, Prudence noticed at once, capable and tired. Her name was Mrs. Enderby, and she said, "Your Grace, welcome to Harrowmere." And Prudence, who was not yet her Grace, said, "Thank you, Mrs. Enderby. I am not yet, I think, entitled to that address. Miss Ashcombe will do until the 8th. Mrs. Enderby's mouth did something small and pleased at one corner, as though she had received a piece of good news she had not expected. "Miss Ashcombe, if you will come this way. His Grace is with the boy. He asked to be informed the moment you arrived." "Do not inform him," Prudence said. "Let him be with the boy. Show me the nursery from the doorway. I do not wish to enter yet. I only wish to see the door." The housekeeper looked at her for a beat longer than a housekeeper was supposed to, and then she said, "Yes, Miss Ashcombe, this way." The nursery was on the second floor, at the end of a corridor whose curtains had all been drawn. Prudence noticed this. She noticed that the sconces had been lit though it was only 4 in the afternoon, and that the light was low and yellow and unhappy, and that the corridor smelled faintly of dust, as though someone had ordered it swept but not opened. Mrs. Enderby stopped a decent distance from the nursery door, which was slightly ajar. Through the crack, Prudence could see a slice of a room that had been prepared, at some point, for a much smaller and happier child than the one who lived in it now. A rocking horse whose paint had faded, a little painted chest, and on the floor by the window a boy of about 7, sitting quite still, with his back to the door, holding what appeared to be a folded piece of ribbon in one hand. He did not move. She could not see his face. The curtains behind him were drawn. The Duke was sitting on the floor beside him, not on a chair, on the floor, at a slight distance, in the perfectly cut coat of a man worth 12,000 a year, with his long legs folded to one side. He was reading aloud, very quietly, so quietly Prudence could not make out the words, from a book in his lap. He was not looking at the boy. The boy was not looking at him. And yet somehow, in that quiet, dim room, the two of them were together, and the space between them was not empty. It was held. Prudence found that her throat had closed. She stepped back from the doorway. "Mrs. Enderby," she said, and her voice was, she was relieved to hear, quite even. "Tomorrow, before breakfast, I would like you to walk me through every room in the east wing. I would like a list of the fires that are lit and the fires that are not, the curtains that are opened and the curtains that are not, and the names, in order of length of service, of every person on the staff. I would like it in writing if you will do me the kindness. I do not intend to change anything for a week. I intend to look." The housekeeper's mouth did the small, pleased thing again. "Yes, Miss Ashcombe." "And Mrs. Enderby, the boy's name?" "Master Thomas, miss." "Thomas," Prudence repeated, and the housekeeper, who was, it turned out, one of the 2 people in that house who had loved the late Duchess enough to grieve her openly, heard the way Prudence said the name, and looked at her again with a look that Prudence, later, would remember as the first look of welcome she had received in a decade. The wedding was small. It was held in the private chapel on the estate, and it was witnessed by Mrs. Enderby, by the Duke's solicitor, Mr. Halloran, by the vicar, and by Thomas, who stood in the front pew in a clean coat, and did not sing the responses, and did not look at either of them, and did not, when it was over, refuse Prudence's hand when she offered it. He did not take it, but he did not refuse it. There is, sometimes, a distinction between the two, and Prudence held to it. The Duke of Harrowmere, Nathaniel, she was to call him, though for the first 3 weeks she found she could not, and continued to call him Your Grace at all hours, as though rank were a head she could hide behind, went back to his study after the wedding breakfast, and Prudence went upstairs and put on a plain dress and went, without ceremony, to find her stepson. She did not go to the nursery. She went instead to the housekeeper's list, and she picked a fact from it, that the curtains on the south side of the second floor had not been opened in 18 months, and she went to the second floor, and she began, one window at a time, to open them. She did not go past the nursery. She stopped 4 doors short of it. She opened every curtain in the corridor between the top of the stairs and Thomas's door, and she opened them slowly, and she opened them one by one, and she did not close them again, and she did not, on that first afternoon, look toward the nursery once. She did the same thing the next day, and the next. On the 4th day, a bright cold morning, the sort of morning where frost had lain on the lawns and the sun had come up hard behind it, she opened the last curtain in the corridor, the one nearest the nursery door, and as she did so, she heard, very faintly, the sound of a small foot moving on floorboard on the other side of the door. She did not turn her head, She fastened the curtain tie. She said, quite to herself, in a low, even voice, as though she were speaking to the frost, "The light is very good today. My father used to say the light on a frost morning was the best light in the year for reading." And she walked away, and she did not look back. That afternoon, when Mrs. Enderby brought her the day's report, she said, "Miss, Your Grace, the nursery curtain, on the south side, it was opened, a crack, from the inside." Prudence set down her pen. She did not smile. She said only, "Thank you, Mrs. Enderby. Please do not close it. If Master Thomas opens a curtain, no one in this house closes it. Not for weather, not for propriety, not for anything. If it is a nuisance to the staff, come to me and we will find a way." "Yes, Your Grace." "Miss Ashcombe still, please, until I am sure of the house." "Yes, miss." That evening at dinner, a long formal dinner for two at a table built for 20, the Duke looked up from his soup and said, without preamble, "Enderby tells me the boy opened a curtain." Prudence said, "He did." "How?" "I opened all the others. It seemed impolite for his to be the only one closed." The Duke of Harrowmere looked at her across the 20 feet of polished mahogany and said nothing for a moment. And then he said, quietly, "I did not think of that." "No, Your Grace. Men do not always think of curtains." "Nathaniel," he said. "I beg your pardon?" "My name, Nathaniel. It has been a fortnight." She looked down at her soup. She did not, that evening, use it, but she registered with the small, dry corner of her mind that was gradually growing warmer without her permission, that he had asked. The house began, slowly, to warm. I say slowly, child, because it is important that you understand it did not warm at once. Harrowmere was a house that had been cold for 4 winters, and a cold house does not thaw in a week. There were servants who watched Prudence with the skeptical patience of people who had already watched 4 governesses come and go, and who assumed she would go too. There was the boy, who did not speak, and who opened a curtain a week, and who allowed her, by the end of the first month, to sit in the same room with him for a quarter of an hour at a time, provided she did not look at him and did not address him, and did not, on any account, sing. There was the housekeeper, who had begun to bring Prudence her tea in the small east parlor rather than the great drawing-room, without having been asked, because she had noticed that Prudence used the small parlor and had not felt entitled to say so. And there was the Duke, Nathaniel, who was, Prudence discovered by the 3rd week, in the habit of finding reasons to be in whatever room she was in, and who did not seem to have noticed this about himself, and whom she did not, for a great many reasons, point it out to. He noticed her, always. That was the thing. He noticed when her hands were cold and he had a fire built up. He noticed that she preferred the small east parlor and had a good chair moved into it. He noticed, one evening when she came in from the garden with her hair a little loose from the wind, that she was, he did not say beautiful, not yet, but she was, he said, in a voice pitched very low, "Well, Prudence." Just that. Well, Prudence, as though she were a piece of weather that had turned out better than expected. She laughed, in surprise, and it was the first time she had laughed in that house, and Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Harrowmere, looked at her across the little parlor as though someone had just handed him something he had not known he was owed. On the last day of that first month, Thomas came into the small east parlor, where Prudence was mending a torn edge of her sleeve. She had refused still to have her clothes replaced. And he sat down on the floor about 4 feet from her chair, and he took out of his pocket the folded ribbon she had seen him holding on her first day, and he laid it on the rug between them, and he did not look at her, and he did not speak, but he stayed. He stayed for a full 3/4 of an hour, and when Mrs. Enderby came in to say that supper was ready, Thomas picked up the ribbon and put it back in his pocket and left the room, and Prudence, whose fingers had not moved on the mending for 40 of those 45 minutes, discovered that she was crying. She was crying quite noiselessly, because she had trained herself never to cry aloud in a house. Nathaniel came in a moment later. He had been meant to be in the study and was not. And he saw the tears, and he did not ask about them. He came and sat on the arm of her chair, which was a thing he had never done, and he put one large warm hand very briefly on her shoulder, and he said, "It was his mother's ribbon." "I thought it might be. She used to tie it in his hair when he was small. He hides it in his pocket. He believes we do not know." "Then we will continue not to know," Prudence said. Nathaniel Vane did not move his hand for a long moment, and then he took it away, and he said, very quietly, "I did not expect to care whether you stayed." She looked up at him. He did not look back. He was looking at the fire. "I mean," he said, "I made an arrangement. I did not intend that it. I find I care very much whether you stay. I did not intend to tell you that. I'm telling you badly." "You are telling me plainly," Prudence said. "That is not the same thing as badly." He did not answer that. He stood, after a moment, and he went to the door, and he stopped there, and he said, without turning, "There is a woman coming here on Thursday. My mother-in-law. She has withdrawn her petition to the trustees. I had word this morning, but she has asked to be received. I will not have her cross the threshold if you do not wish it." "She has withdrawn the petition?" "Yes." "Then she has lost, and she is coming to see who beat her." "Yes." "Let her come. I would like to meet the woman who told a child his voice killed his mother." Nathaniel turned then, at the door, and he looked at her, and the look was not the look of a man discharging an arrangement. It was the look of a man who had, without meaning to, put down a burden he had been carrying so long he no longer knew he was carrying it. "Prudence," he said. "Nathaniel." The first time she used his name. He stood in the doorway a moment longer, and then he went, and Prudence sat by the fire with the mending in her lap, and she understood, quite plainly, that the arrangement had ended some weeks ago, and that neither of them had, until this evening, been prepared to say so. The Dowager Countess of Marwood arrived on Thursday in a black carriage, and she was announced by Mrs. Enderby with the small, quiet malice of a servant, announcing a person she has not liked for 20 years. She was a small, handsome, upright woman of 60, with the same eyes as her dead daughter and her grieving grandson, and she came into the drawing-room in a mourning that had gone on so long it had begun to look like a costume, and she looked at Prudence for a full 10 seconds without speaking, and then she said, "So?" Prudence said, "Countess, please sit down. There is tea." "I did not come for tea." "No, but there is tea, and I would prefer you sat down. Nathaniel is with Thomas. He will not be long." The Countess sat. She sat, and she took her gloves off, finger by finger, and she said, "I hear you have been opening curtains." "I have." "On what authority?" "On my own. I am the boy's stepmother. I have full authority in the nursery. It was a condition of my marriage. Your son-in-law honors it. You are the boy's nothing. You have been in this house 6 weeks. 7, said Prudence evenly. "And I am not his mother. I have never claimed to be. I do not intend to be. His mother is dead, and she is deeply mourned in this house, and her portrait hangs where it hung, and her hymn is sung to him when he asks for it, which he has now asked twice, which is, I believe, twice more than in the 18 months before I came." The Countess's mouth tightened. "He sings?" "He hums. He has hummed once, in the garden, 2 Sundays ago. I did not remark on it. I did not tell his father until the next day. I do not intend to make an event of it. I intend to let him find his voice in his own time, which is what he would have done from the beginning if a certain grieving person had not told him that his voice was the thing that killed his mother. The Countess of Marwood went white. She went white and she did not speak. Prudence poured the tea. She did it slowly and correctly. She handed the Countess her cup and she said without heat, "I do not know what you meant when you said it, my lady. I suspect you did not mean the whole of what he took from it. Grief makes fools of the cleverest of us, and I have no interest in adding another cruelty to a house that has had 4 winters of them. But you will not, in this house, ever speak against my authority in that nursery again. If you wish to see your grandson, you will see him on the terms I set, which are that no one in this house tells him what his voice can and cannot do. Do we understand each other?" The Countess took a very careful sip of her tea. "You are not what I expected," she said at last. "No, my lady. My stepmother said the same thing, in a rather different tone, some weeks ago. I am accustomed to not being expected." The Countess looked at her for a long moment, and Prudence, who had not been prepared for it, would remember this all her life, the small, handsome, upright woman set down her teacup and said, in a voice that had lost its metal, "I said it, because I could not bear to hear him sing, because his voice was so like hers. Do you understand? I could not bear to hear him sing. I have hated myself for it every night since. I withdrew the petition because my solicitor told me that a woman had come into this house, who had opened the curtains. I did not believe him. I came to see." Prudence said quietly, "Then stay to supper, my lady, and when Thomas comes down, you will tell him, you yourself, in your own voice, that his singing did not tire his mother, that his mother loved his singing, that you were wrong. You will do it in front of me and in front of his father, and you will do it because he is 7 years old and he has been carrying it for 2 years, and it is not a thing he can put down without help." The Countess of Marwood looked at Prudence Vane, Duchess of Harrowmere, and she said, "Yes," and she did. She did, that very evening, in the small east parlor, with Nathaniel standing by the mantel and Prudence in her chair and Thomas on the floor with the ribbon in his hand. And it was not clean, and it was not tidy, and it was not the sort of thing anyone would have chosen to watch. But the Countess got down on her knees in her black silk in front of her grandson, and she said, in a voice that broke twice, "Thomas, I told you a wicked thing. I told you your singing tired your mother. It did not. It was the fever. It was only the fever. Your mother loved your singing. Your mother said, at the end, that she wanted to hear you sing at Christmas. Do you hear me, child? It was not you." And Thomas, who had not spoken above a whisper in 18 months, Thomas looked up from the ribbon, and he looked at his grandmother, and he said, very small and very hoarse, one word, "Truly?" "Truly," said the Countess. And the boy began, quite quietly, to cry, and Prudence, from her chair, did not move. She had learned, by this point, not to move at the moments that mattered. But Nathaniel came across the room, and he sat down on the floor beside his son, in his perfectly cut coat, and he put his arm around the boy for the first time since the funeral, and Thomas leaned into him and did not pull away. The Countess stayed 3 days. She left on the 4th, having asked Prudence, not commanded, whether she might come again at Christmas. "You will always be welcome, my lady," Prudence said. "You are his grandmother. I could tell you, child, that this was the end of it, that the curtains stayed open and the boy sang at Christmas, and the Duke and his stout Duchess lived warmly ever after, and no more trouble came. But the world is not so kind, and the story is not yet finished, because there was a second antagonist in this tale, who had not yet shown his hand, and he was not a woman in mourning silk. He was a man who had been very careful. His name was Rupert Ashcombe, and he was Prudence's cousin, and he had, at the reading of her father's will 9 years ago, been appointed trustee of a small parcel of land in the north that had belonged to Prudence's mother, and that had passed to Prudence, and that Prudence had never, in 9 years, thought about, because her cousin Rupert managed it, and her cousin Rupert sent her, once a year, a polite letter saying that the rents did not quite cover the repairs, and Prudence, who had no other income and had never seen the land, had believed him. She might have gone on believing him, had she not, in her first month at Harrowmere, had cause to write to her father's old solicitor, Mr. Halloran, on quite another matter, and had Mr. Honor Halloran not written back, in the careful sideways way of old solicitors, that he would be greatly obliged if her Grace would, at her convenience, permit him to lay before her certain matters regarding the northern property that he had not felt at liberty to raise while she remained under her stepmother's roof. Prudence read that letter twice. She took it to Nathaniel. Nathaniel, who had grown up in a world where forged papers were a regular hazard of owning things, read it once and said, "Prudence, your cousin is stealing from you." "I gathered as much." "Have you an objection to me finding out how much?" "None." He found out how much in 9 days, using his own solicitor and 2 clerks, and a very quiet visit to the north. The answer was, a great deal. The land, it transpired, was not a small parcel. It was 3 farms and a mill, and the rents were substantial, and Rupert Ashcombe had been drawing them for 9 years, and remitting to Prudence, out of what he called the residue after expenses, a sum roughly equal to the pin money her stepmother had allowed her for gloves. He had been keeping the rest. He had been keeping, in fact, close to £1,100 a year, and he had done it, Nathaniel's solicitor reported, on the strength of a set of accounts so casually forged that they could only have been created by a man who had never once believed the beneficiary would look. "He believed," said Nathaniel, over supper on the 9th evening, "that you were the fat girl no one would take." Prudence did not flinch at the word. She had been waiting, she realized, to see whether he would use it. He had used it. He had used it precisely, and in the mouth of another, and in defense of her, and she found, to her surprise, that she was not wounded by it at all. "He believed," she said, "that I would never be in a position to ask." "Yes." "He is coming to the christening next month." "He is." "Do not confront him privately." Nathaniel looked up. "Prudence." "Do not confront him privately, Nathaniel. He has taken from me in silence for 9 years. He will answer in a room." Nathaniel Vane, Duke of Harrowmere, set down his glass and looked at his wife across a table that was no longer 20 feet long, because they had, some weeks earlier, quietly begun to eat at the small end of it, and he said, "You are a formidable woman, Prudence." "I am a woman who has done the sums, Nathaniel. There is a difference." "There is not," he said, "as much of one as you suppose." The christening of the Duke of Harrowmere's godchild, the small daughter of his nearest neighbor, was, by long tradition, held at Harrowmere itself, and it drew, that spring, some 60 guests of the county's first families. Rupert Ashcombe came, in a new coat. Prudence's stepmother came, in a new hat. Prudence's 2 prettier sisters came, in new pearls that Prudence, at a glance, could see were the same as the old ones with the string retied. And Prudence, in a dress the color of good claret that Nathaniel had ordered from London without asking her, and that had been cut, at his instruction, to make no apology for her body at all, received them in the great hall of Harrowmere with the Countess of Marwood at her right hand and Thomas at her left, and she did not once, in the receiving, catch her stepmother's eye. She waited until after the service. She waited until the 60 guests had been seated at the long tables in the great hall, and the wine had been poured, and the first course had been placed. She waited until Rupert Ashcombe, halfway down the second table, had drunk enough to be pleased with himself, but not enough to be quick. And then she stood up. The room went quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when the hostess stands up before the toasts. "My lords, ladies and friends," said Prudence, "before we drink the child's health, I have a small matter of household business that I must, with regret, conduct in public. I would not do it here if I could do it elsewhere. But some kinds of theft cannot be settled in a private room. Cousin Rupert, will you stand up?" Rupert Ashcombe, halfway through a mouthful of soup, did not stand up. "Cousin," Prudence said, quite pleasantly, "will you stand up, or shall I have Mr. Halloran read the account sitting down?" Mr. Halloran, at the end of the top table, rose gently to his feet with a leather folder in his hand. Rupert stood up. He was a well-fed man of 40, with pink cheeks and small, clever eyes, and the eyes were doing the same arithmetic Prudence had watched her stepmother do in the Ashcombe drawing room, and were arriving at the same answer, and the answer was that he had misjudged everything. "Cousin Rupert," Prudence said, "for 9 years you have administered a property that was left to me by my mother. For 9 years you have returned to me, from that property, some £52 a year. Mr. Halloran has, in the past 11 days, examined the actual rents, the actual expenses, and the actual accounts. The property has yielded, in each of those years, an average sum of £1,140. You have kept, cousin, something in the region of £9,800 of my money. I mention it now in this company, not because I intend to prosecute, I do not for the sake of the family name my father left me, but because I intend that every person in this hall will know, before they leave it, that when my stepmother said, 3 months ago, in the hearing of my husband, that no one would take the fat girl, it was because she was under the impression that the fat girl had nothing to be taken for. She was mistaken. She was mistaken by £9,800. Sit down, cousin. You will remit what you owe within the quarter, and you will not, ever, be received at Harrowmere again." Rupert Ashcombe sat down. He sat down white as the tablecloth, and he did not eat any more of the soup. Prudence turned, very calmly, to the second table, where her stepmother was sitting with her mouth slightly open. "Mrs. Ashcombe," she said, "you will remain to the end of the meal, because to ask you to leave would be to insult my guests. Tomorrow you will return to my father's house, which is my house, and which I will permit you to occupy, out of respect for my father's memory, for so long as you conduct yourself with decency. You will not, in that house, speak of me. You will not describe our arrangement to your friends. You will not, ever again, refer in my hearing, or in the hearing of anyone in this county, to my person or my size, in the terms you used the night I met my husband. If you do, I will know within the week, and you will find a smaller house waiting for you. Do we understand each other?" Millicent Ashcombe, whose silver laugh had not been heard in 3 months, made a small sound and nodded. "Good," said Prudence, and she sat down. The hall was so quiet that the sound of Thomas at her left, of his own accord, reaching up and putting his small hand into hers, was audible to the second table. And then Nathaniel stood. He stood at the head of his own table, and he raised his glass, and he said, and his voice was the voice she had first heard in her father's hall, the low, even voice of a man who did not waste words, "To my wife, who is the finest woman I have ever known, who came into a cold house and warmed it, who came to a silent child and gave him back his voice, who was told by her family that no one would take her, and who has taken instead the whole of my regard, and the whole of my house, and the whole of my heart. I did not ask her to marry me for love. I ask her now, in front of you, to forgive me for that, and to permit me, from this day, to be married to her for no other reason at all. To the Duchess of Harrowmere, to Prudence." 60 glasses rose, 60 voices said her name, and at the head of the table, Thomas, small, quiet Thomas, whose grandmother sat weeping quite openly at his other side. Thomas looked up at the woman whose hand he was holding, and he said, in a voice a little louder than a whisper, but not yet quite a full voice, "To Mama. I could end it there, child, and it would be a fine place to end. But there is one more room in this story, and it belongs to them, and it would be a discourtesy to leave without it. That night, when the last carriage had gone and the last candle in the great hall had been snuffed, and Thomas had been put to bed in a room whose curtains were now, and had been for a month, permanently open. Prudence went into the small east parlor and sat down in her chair. She had not, in the whole of the christening, allowed herself to weep. She did not now. She simply sat, and she looked at the fire, and after a while Nathaniel came in and closed the door. He did not sit on the arm of her chair. He sat on,